Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Voices of Esqueo. I'm your host, Shawnee Atsley, and I'm so glad you're joining us today. In today's episode, we're going to explore the power of Indigenous storytelling, how stories shape identity and community, and the important role they play in inspiring leadership across generations. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we're recording on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation of Alberta. We honor the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples whose stewardship, knowledge, and connection to this land have endured for countless generations. In each episode, we share a word or phrase from one of our languages. For this episode, our phrase is Mio Kisigao. Mio meaning good, and Kisigao meaning day. Together, the phrase translates to it's a good day or nice day. Mio Kisigao. I'm delighted to be joined by Kathleen McDermott, storyteller and documentary filmmaker. Her latest documentary, What We Carry, premiered at the Edmonton International Film Festival and was featured at the Santa Barbara International Film Festival earlier this year. Together, we're going to talk about the impact of Indigenous storytelling, how it empowers youth, strengthens leadership, and preserves culture. We'll also hear about Kathleen's own journey as a storyteller, the experiences that shaped what we carry, and why stories continue to be one of our most powerful ways of connecting with one another. Let's get started. Kat, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So, Kat, I'd love to start by getting to know a little bit more about you and your journey. I think it's always fascinating to learn how people find their way to the work they're meant to do because, everyone knows no two paths ever seem to look the same. Storytelling can begin in so many different ways for different people. Sometimes it's rooted in family, community, or culture. Sometimes it's sparked by a single experience or a moment or a desire to, preserve stories that might otherwise be forgotten. However, it starts, there's usually a moment or a series of moments, right? That sets everything in motion. So take us back to the beginning. What did your journey into storytelling look like? And what first drew you to become a storyteller?
I think as Indigenous people or just people in general, we're naturally drawn to storytelling. Um, Growing up, a lot of the way that we are taught traditionally was through oral teachings and storytelling.
Hmm.
I myself grew up in circle with a bunch of elders in my community, and a lot of the lessons that I learned were through storytelling or sitting in circle and just hearing their versions of the same story but told from their elders,
Hmm.
and being a young person hearing the story that I still don't even know how old these stories are, they would paint these pictures for me.
Hmm.
And naturally, I always wanted to continue as an artist, you always want to continue to live in that world of art.
Hmm.
So I just followed what came natural.
You know, Listening to your journey, one thing that really stood out to me was how naturally everything seemed to come back to your roots. Even as you got older, that connection to story was always there. I think that's something a lot of people will relate to. And as I was listening, it also reminded me that storytelling isn't just about telling a good story, it's about carrying memories and sharing knowledge, preserving culture, and, creating connections between people and generations. That's especially true when we talk about Indigenous storytelling. And I'd love to dig into that a little bit more. We touched on earlier when you talked about where your journey started, but I'm curious how your perspective has grown over the years, looking at it now through everything you've experienced as an adult and a storyteller and as a filmmaker. What does storytelling mean to you personally today?
So currently I'm working with young people,
Hmm.
and working with young people, it's that constant reminder of why storytelling is so important. It's these stories that keep our traditions alive. It's these stories, like you said, it's our responsibility to listen to these stories and to understand the intent behind them, the lessons behind them, and to share them the way that they were shared with you. Because the moment you start adapting it or changing it, it's no longer that story that has life,
Mhm.
because everything in our culture has a spirit, has a life. Even our stories, their ways of being, their ways of understanding. It's a way for us to connect our past, our present, our future
Mhm.
with our young people.
Yeah.
So being able to hear the stories from our elders and remember them throughout our life and share them with the young people in the same way they were shared with you. It's like passing a torch.
Mhm.
And when you're a storyteller, you never really know who you're passing that torch to. But as somebody who's sitting in these circles or listening to these stories, you automatically know if you are responsible. And I've always felt responsible
Yeah.
for the stories in my community and the stories when I sat with elders.
Mhm.
There's a lot of things that I've been privileged to know that I didn't realize a lot of people growing up didn't have that same opportunity to understand because they didn't get to sit with elders. They didn't get to listen to these stories and grow up in a world where there's just so much history and knowledge that not many people are aware of.
Mhm. I really love what you said about stories having a life of their own. That really stuck with me because I don't think we often think of stories that way. We usually think of storytelling as something we create, but you're talking about stories as something we're entrusted with, something we're meant to care for and carry forward. Um, and I also loved what you said about passing the torch. That image feels so powerful because it reminds us that storytelling isn't just about preserving the past. It's also about making sure those teachings, those experiences, and those ways of knowing continue to reach the next generation. You also talked about how not everyone has had the opportunity to sit with elders or hear those stories firsthand. And that got me thinking a little bit about leadership. And when people hear the word leader, they often picture someone in a formal role, whether that's, chief on council, government roles, federal, provincial, or even an executive position. But leadership can also look like so many different things, right? Sometimes it's the people who are preserving culture, opening doors, challenging old narratives, and, even making space for others to follow. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of what storytelling does, right? It doesn't just preserve knowledge, it also inspires people and builds understanding, and it helps shape what's possible for the future. And with that being said, I'm curious, when you think about your own journey, how has storytelling shaped the way you see leadership, both in your own life and within Indigenous communities?
I think storytelling is important for a lot of things. Cultural preservation, accountability, actually. I think storytelling, we live in a world where our people walk both in a traditional and a non-traditional sense.
Hmm.
And for people who, like our leadership, for instance, that weren't fortunate enough to grow up with elders, grow up in ceremony, the ones that had to adapt because of survival, they didn't get those opportunities to sit in those ceremonies or sit with those elders and hear these stories and why it's important for us to preserve the land or preserve the language or even preserve our sustainability as an economy. We have these stories that teach us how we
Yeah.
can sustain ourselves, how we can provide for ourselves, and not just for ourselves, for all of Canada.
Hmm.
If people took the time to go and sit with an elder and hear the way that it was in those times, there was a lot of hard work, but they had a lot of opportunity to spend time together and learn from each other. And how they did that was through storytelling.
Mhm.
And that's what storytelling does. It
Mhm.
allows you to share knowledge with people who might not have had the opportunity to sit in those circles and learn that knowledge.
Yeah.
Storytelling is a way that you can connect with people and help them understand a side of something that they might not have ever experienced.
When you talked about storytelling giving people the chance to learn from circles they may never have had the opportunity to sit in themselves, I thought that was such a powerful way to describe it because, well, in reality, not everyone grows up with elders in their lives or has access to those teachings, right? But stories do also have a way of reaching people wherever they are, and they can also create understanding and, like build empathy and bridge those gaps between different experiences and generations. It also made me think about something you touched on earlier, that stories don't just preserve culture, they can actually shift the way people see the world. They can challenge assumptions, open up conversations, and sometimes even inspire people to think or act differently, right? I can also see how those lessons around leadership and responsibility have shaped you personally and how they connect so naturally to the work you do as a storyteller. And with that being said, I want to turn our attention now to your documentary, What We Carry. I'm curious about where the story began for you. Like, what inspired you to get involved with this particular project? And what about this story really drew you in?
So, the thing that drew me to What We Carry was that this story was about two non Indigenous people trying to connect with their grandmother or their mother who taught at residential school. And in all of my years of watching films, Indigenous films, reading books, I've never seen the perspective of somebody who taught at these schools or worked at these schools or in these systems want to know how it impacts them as an individual.
Mhm.
And I thought it was super fascinating. It was an onion that I was wanting to peel. I wanted to go through all of those layers and kind of unpack that with them.
Mhm.
What are these people carrying who taught in these institutions? Do they have guilt? Do they have shame? As somebody who's the granddaughter or the daughter of somebody that worked at these schools, taught at these schools, observed the abuse in these schools, do you feel any guilt? Do you feel any shame? I thought that was a great question.
Mhm.
And I really wanted to dig deeper into what that meant. So that's what drew me to it. Why I wanted to become involved in the project was going back to that art of storytelling. Um, I felt, again, it was my responsibility as a storyteller to make sure that the story that we were telling was one, honest, but two, holding people accountable.
Yeah, that is such an interesting perspective because you're right. We often hear about the experiences of survivors and their families, and those stories are absolutely essential. Of course, they are. But we don't often hear from the families of the people who worked within those institutions or what they may be carrying themselves and processing generations later, right? And what really stood out to me was what you said about accountability. Now, it sounds like throughout the process of this story, you weren't trying to make this story about excusing anyone or pointing fingers, but rather about creating space for a more honest and difficult conversation, one where people can ask hard questions and sit with some uncomfortable truths, right? And I imagine that was a really delicate balance as a filmmaker and a storyteller, especially with, a piece of history that's so painful and personal for so many people. I'm sure there were moments throughout the process that were like incredibly heavy. What did this project teach you about the power of storytelling?
The biggest process that it taught me was Again, going back to that responsibility, I owed it to my community. I owed it to my elders, our ancestors, to make sure that I was honoring the history,
Mhm.
that I was sharing the truth, but I also had to be very cautious of other people's feelings.
Mm.
And for me, I think that was the most important part of Indigenous storytelling.
I think it's easy to forget that storytelling comes with a huge amount of responsibility sometimes, especially when you're telling stories that carry so much history and emotion. What I hear you saying is that it's not just about telling the truth, it's about telling it with care. It's about honoring, the people who lived it, respecting the people who are still carrying it today, and recognizing the impact those stories can have on everyone who hears them. And I think it's such a powerful reminder, especially today when stories can travel so quickly and reach so many people. And, looking back at Indigenous history, it is so important that we never forget what happened and that we continue to honor those truths. But I think it's also important to look forward and think about the next generation because they're the ones who will carry these stories into the future, right? And for the young Indigenous storytellers who might be listening today, maybe they're writers, filmmakers, artists, photographers, or simply people who have a story they want to tell. What advice would you give them as they begin finding their own voice?
One, don't underestimate your community. There's lots of stories in our communities. There's lots of rich history in our communities. Um, there's a time where I wasn't proud of being an Indigenous woman, and there was times where I failed my responsibility as being a good listener. I think that we still have lots of great storytellers. We still have lots of elders who know a lot of our oral history. Um, I think as a young Indigenous storyteller, go sit with some elders and hear some of our true history, the way that our elders would have heard it when they were young people, when they were babies, 5, 6, 7. When you can connect with an elder that way, you're able to bring them back to a time where things made sense. And I think allowing yourself that blessing is what's going to help guide you. That's what helped guided me in this
Hmm.
whole process was my community and that connection to storytelling.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for my elders, I would have been useless on the project. There was
Hmm.
lots of people that I didn't really do much. I just connected them to other storytellers in my community,
Yeah.
and we all had this moment to share the history of what happened in our community.
Hmm.
So I, I would always say go back to your roots. And then moving forward, don't be stuck on our trauma. We're more than just our trauma.
Yes.
You know, if
Yes.
we look at North of North, they're killing it right now. I would like to see more content like that.
Yeah.
Um, uh, what's his name? Trevor Soloway, also a great filmmaker right now.
Yeah.
You know, he's utilizing our Indigenous stories, but creating our own Indigenous horror genre. Like, isn't that so cool? We've got an Indigenous horror genre.
Hmm.
So great. You know, we are more than just our trauma. We actually are very creative. We have lots of oral stories that we would tell our young people so that they
Yeah.
would learn these lessons, like the choo choo man and the boogeyman and
Hmm.
you don't whistle at the northern lights. There's all these great stories
Yeah. Yeah. I
that
know exactly what you're talking about.
we can now share in a more lighthearted way. I'm just so excited for the future of storytelling.
Oh my God, I absolutely agree with you 100%. I think that we are at such an exciting moment right now. For so long, Indigenous stories have often been told through kind of a narrow lens, right? But now we're seeing Indigenous creators telling every kind of story imaginable: comedy, horror, documentaries, sci fi thrillers. And, the possibilities are endless right now. And I really appreciate that you said to not let our stories be defined solely by trauma. That history will always matter and it always deserves to be remembered, but it isn't the whole story, right? Like, we have humor, love, resilience, imagination, and incredible oral traditions that have been passed down for generations. Like you said, don't whistle at night, the choo choo man. And there's so many stories still waiting to be told. It's exciting to think about where Indigenous storytelling is headed over the next 10 or 20 years because I really feel like we're only scratching the surface now. Like, there's so much talent, creativity, and so many voices that the world hasn't heard yet. And I really hope conversations like this encourage more people to tell their stories because, you never know whose life your story might change. Now, that being said, what stories do you think still need to be told?
I think that's that. I think we need to start telling our jokes. I think we need to bring, those deadly anti-laughs out of
Yeah.
everyone. We lived in our hurt both off and on screen for centuries. I think it's time for us to tell stories where we can just laugh. I think that's where we are right now is we're looking at the shift in indigenous storytelling from that survival state or sharing our social injustices where we can now share all the other things that we as indigenous people contribute.
It's almost like a celebration.
Yes. And that's what I am most excited for. I just look forward for yeah, for that. I think we're at that place now where our young people can be comedians.
Your excitement is so contagious. And you're right. There really does feel like there's a shift happening right now. And it's not about leaving our history behind because, that history will always be a part of who we are as Indigenous people. And it's about recognizing that our stories are so much bigger than our pain, right? Like, we can tell stories that make people laugh, that make people fall in love, that make them jump out of their seats or simply see the world a little bit differently, right? And I think that's something really special for young Indigenous creators to hear, that they don't have to fit into one box. They can be filmmakers, comedians, novelists, horror writers, animators, even musicians. They can tell any story they want while still bringing their own perspective and identity to it. And I think that's so incredibly exciting for the future. And speaking of exciting moments, I wanted to touch on your documentary, which has already had a pretty incredible journey of its own. It premiered at the International Film Festival and or the Edmonton International Film Festival, sorry, and was later selected for the Santa Barbara International Film Festival, which is such an amazing achievement. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah. So first we got invited to the Edmonton International Film Festival. That was our world premiere. And it's when we started filming, you just put things out into the universe. Wouldn't it
Mhm.
be cool if this happened, if this happened, if this happened? And when we were creating the project right at the very beginning, I was like, yeah, it would be cool if we could have the world premiere here in Alberta, if it could be close to Orange Shirt Day, National Truth and Reconciliation Day. Like, ideally, in a perfect world, that's what I'd like to see. And our original release date was supposed to happen many, many, many years before this. But because of COVID, filming had to stop and we had to wait, put a halt on production for a while. And then when we finally got to finish the production, um, we were near the end of basically like all the festival runs and whatever.
Mhm.
So they decided, well, we'll release it on this day. You guys can have from this time to this time to go and do your festival run, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, cool, sounds great. And then, yeah, Bracken, my co producer, was the one that submitted everything to all the film festivals. And she was doing all her magic. And she's like, yeah, we got invited to the Edmonton International Film Festival, and you got your wish. It's going to be on this day, and this is our world premiere. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. Super grateful. Like, that was so cool. Again, rewinding it back to the start, put it out in the universe. I was like, and then after we do our world premiere in Alberta, we'll get invited to all these international film festivals, and our project will get out there and people will see it and we'll start the conversation. I really want to just stir the pot a bit. And we did. We totally stirred the pot. Um, Santa messaged us back and they're like, hey, we love your film. We were this close to winning, I forget which award, but they deliberated back and forth for about an hour.
Mhm.
And ultimately, it was the local film that won. And I think that's kind of why they won, was just to support their local
Yeah.
talent and their local economy. But to hear that they were in deliberation for over an hour about who should win and um, the importance of our story wasn't the People's Choice Awards, but it was one of those types of awards. It was super cool.
Mhm.
Was really well received by the community. We got 2 days to premiere it in Santa Barbara. They did a really great job at filling the seats. So day one, we had, I'd say, probably about 100 people in the audience.
Mhm.
And then on day two, we were in the smaller theater. I think they said capacity is at 100, and we were almost sold out for that. So both nights, I guess in total, we would have sold out about 200 tickets. 200 people got to see our film in Santa Barbara, and it was super cool. Um, they don't do land acknowledgments in the United States,
Yeah.
and every opening that we do, every premiere that we do, screening, will open with a prayer and a smudge and a land acknowledgement.
Mhm.
So, because I'm not a native from California, I wanted to give respect to the California native, which are the Chumash people.
Mhm.
And the audience were just blown away. They loved it. It was so
Mhm.
cool, so powerful, so impactful. It was super cool.
Yeah.
Super great experience.
That must have been such an incredible moment. Not only to see what we carry resonate with audiences here at home in Alberta, but also to watch it connect with people internationally as well. I also really enjoyed listening to you share about beginning each screening with a land acknowledgement and creating space to honor the local Indigenous community there in California. I think it kind of speaks to everything we've been talking about today, that storytelling isn't just about the story itself. It's also about how you choose to tell it and the respect you bring into those spaces, which I think is so important. As we've talked today, one thing has become really clear to me, that storytelling has been the thread connecting everything we've discussed. It's, shaped your career, your values, your relationship with your community, your approach to filmmaking, storytelling, and even the way you've described leadership. So I'd love to kind of end where we began. We kind of did, a full circle. When you look back on your journey, how has storytelling shaped the person you've become?
I wouldn't be who I am if it wasn't for storytelling. Like I said, I grew up in those circles. We used to have cultural camps in my community growing up, and my favorite place, like they used to do all these other things, but most kids would be at the arts and crafts table, building stuff, creating things.
Mhm.
I was in the old people teepees where I was listening to these stories. I love stories.
Mhm.
And then when I think I was like 10 or 11, I got to be a part of a theater group called Kahiwa Native Dance Theater. Shout out to them if you're ever looking for a great Indigenous storyteller to come to your community and share some really great Indigenous stories,
Hmm.
hire them. Rosa John, Melvin John, Kihiwa Native Dance Theater. They did some workshops in my community, and that's where I first got the opportunity to become an actor. I first got the opportunity to see myself on a stage. They took me to my first orchestra ballet. Ballet.
Hmm.
They brought me to my first ballet. Um, and all of those are different forms of storytelling.
Hmm.
So they
Yeah.
opened up and shifted my perspective of what storytelling could be. And then through that, I was able to understand the importance because they built that foundation of the power of a story.
Hmm.
And once I understood the power of a story, I understood the responsibility of listening when an elder speaks. So it forced me to be more engaged with the elders when I would go to these cultural camps and listen to the things that they would share. And sometimes they would be Wasaki chalk stories. Sometimes they would be telling us tales of how to, the season shifts and
Hmm.
what to look out for. They were already talking about climate change way back when I was little, and it wasn't called climate change back then. They just said that these are things to be aware of. And when
Hmm.
you notice that the stripes on a caterpillar, for instance, if they're so far apart, it's going to be a drought. If I forget which bug it is, but a certain bug is the first bug that comes out at the beginning of spring. And that's when you know that spring is on its way and everything else is
Hmm.
coming.
Yeah.
Until you start seeing those bugs around, even though the weather might be warm and the snow might be melting, it's not spring until that larvae shows because that's the first food source for all these other things that
Hmm.
help bring spring in.
Yeah.
And wouldn't know any of it if it wasn't, if I didn't have the community that I had, if
Yeah.
there wasn't already these great storytellers that made sure we as the young people understood the importance of storytelling.
Hearing you talk about theater, cultural camps, and the lessons your elders shared, it's easy to see how every one of those experiences shaped the storyteller and the leader you've become today. To our listeners, to find out more about the documentary What We Carry, visit their Instagram page at What We Carry Doc. Kathleen, thank you so much for sharing your time, your experiences, and your wisdom with us today. It's been such a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us for this episode of Voices of Esqueo. Today's conversation is a reminder that stories are more than words. They carry our histories, our culture, our teachings, and our hopes for the future. As Kathleen shared so beautifully, storytelling is both a privilege and a responsibility. It's how we honor those who came before us while inspiring those who will come after. Be sure to follow Voices of Esqueo wherever you get your podcast. Until next time, I'm Shawnee Yatsale. Thanks for joining.